All right, so this presentation is going to be mainly to help you understand a lot of the different terms and ideas that go along with this poison project. So I'm going to talk about what some poisons can do, what does it mean for it to be a poison, all different kinds of things like that. So let's get to it. I like this quote from Paracelsus, and it says, "All substances are poisons. There is none which is not. The right dose differentiates a poison and remedy." And it is totally true, because there are some poisons, like digitalis, which is from a plant, and if you eat it, it can cause heart problems, like your heart arrhythmia, they can cause death. But they're like, wait a second. If this medication, or not medication, if this chemical causes the heart to freak out and cause heart attacks, what if we give just a little bit? And they ended up finding that it works to cure things like arrhythmias. So Digitech is a chemical that they use in pharmacies to actually save lives. And things like water. You would think that water is not a poison, there's nothing wrong with water, but if you drink way too much water, like if you drink gallons and gallons of water, your body can actually start reacting in a way that flushes vitamins out of your body, and you can die from excessive water consumption. That's actually the number one way for people to die from taking the drug ecstasy. Normally, it's a relatively non fatal chemical, but you can cause insatiable thirst. And they found people who have just drank so much water that their body ended up shutting down and dying. All right, so let's talk about what this project is going to involve. Here's the background section. Toxicology is the study of poisons and their chemical and physical effects on the body. There have been many cases of people intentionally trying to poison another. We are going to research some cases and explore the forensics behind the toxicology. Each student or pair of students will research a different poison and a case involving that poison. Before you go too far into researching the chemical, read about the case and figure out the exact chemical used in the case to make sure your poison research matches with your case. So if you picked something like arsenic and you're looking at a case, you want to figure out which compound of arsenic was this. Is this arsenic trioxide? Is it some other kind of arsenic? So that when you're doing the research, you're looking at what is the LD50 of arsenic trioxide and not some other chemical that doesn't exactly match up with what you have. Also, the symptoms and effects and toxic levels of different forms of a chemical are different, so it's important to know exactly which one you're looking at. So you can work on this project either individually or you could work on it with a partner. If you're working out with a partner, you just have to make sure that you are documenting exactly what each person does because I'm going to be paying attention to see who is doing what part of each project. So the first part of this project that we're really going to work on is figuring out information about the specific poison you're going to be talking about. So there's type of poison. Type of poison is not necessarily available for every different kind of poison. There's paralytics, there's nerve toxins, there's carcinogens. If you get something like cyanide, it's called a cellular asphyxiant because it blocks the oxygen from being used in the mitochondria. So that's something you may or may not be able to find. If you're struggling with that part, let me know and I can try to help you. Level of toxicity. So every chemical that we're talking about as a poison has a certain quantity that you need to be exposed to be deadly. So I'll talk about what exactly an LD50 is, but some things will have exposure limits. So those would also be something you'd want to include. What's a healthy amount for someone to be exposed to? What's not? Different routes of administration have very different levels of toxicity, so that'll make a difference. The chemistry of the poison means like what is the formula, what is the mass, is this a compound, what state of matter does it exist in at normal temperatures, what are like melting point, boiling point, if it's liquid, that kind of stuff would be useful to know. Um, Giving if it's a big biological molecule, putting an image of what the compound looks like at the molecular level, that would be helpful. So we're really just kind of talking about the actual structure of the molecule itself. Most of the poisons either have other uses or other names. Some of the poisons might be like bug killers or it might be used in industry, but you want to figure out what it's really used for. Big part of it should be effects or symptoms in the body. So what it does to a person, how does it lead to death? That kind of stuff would be a pretty substantial portion of the poison background. Detection, not all chemicals are easily detected, but I want more than they do a blood test. So this one might involve looking at what tests are these, what does it actually mean, trying to figure out what is a high school level explanation of a detection method. Is this thing using like you know, chromatography to separate the blood components, and then it has to use some kind of like mass spectrometer or something to identify the chemical. Like, what do they do to detect it? Maybe there is a color test that they use for chemicals, like at the bedside, and then also what treatment type. So then the next big portion of this whole presentation is the poison case. So who are the important people in the case? Don't just list names. You're supposed to be explaining who they are, why are they important, what did they do. Location is going to be necessary to put in there, but again, it shouldn't just be listed. Happened in Alabama. You should try to really like explain the whole case with location, with people, with the events, with the motive. Put it all together in like I would almost say story form, but like you're trying to give everyone a good feeling of what really happened. But make sure that you talk about evidence. You need to make sure how they were caught, how they're investigated is talked about, what kind of evidence was used to try to like, identify who it was, what evidence was used to convict them. That's going to be an important part of this. Okay, so toxicology, as I mentioned on Monday, I think it was, is the study of adverse effects of chemicals or physical agents on living organisms. So we're talking about poisoning, we're talking about ingesting chemicals and losing your hair, we're talking about people having liver failure from it. There's a lot of different situations where toxicology is used. The one you might automatically think of is post-mortem. Someone dies, and the medical examiner or coroner is going to send their blood out to a lab and have it tested to find the cause of death. But there's also criminal. So if you have an accident, they're going to check to see if a person is under the influence of drugs to see if that is why it happened. Workplace does drug testing. You're not allowed to be under the influence of drugs when you're operating heavy machinery. If a workplace identifies that you're under certain illegal drugs, they're going to fire you. Sports, there's human and animal anti-doping. So humans, all the different bike racing and different things where the people get tested for EPO, and it turns out that the person who wins the Tour de France is almost always found to have been doping, things like that. Olympics, lots of anti-doping in that. And then animal, they were finding that horses were being injected with caffeine that was leading to their death because they were trying to get them to run faster. And lastly, environmental. So industrial and catastrophic events can leave a whole bunch of poisonous chemicals in the surroundings, and they are detected through toxicological methods. While you may think of toxic substances only as being things that can kill you, there's actually four main things that toxic substances could do. They could be a cause of death, so you could ingest a chemical and die from it. Definitely could happen. There's also things that contribute to death. You have an underlying heart problem and you take a drug that wouldn't ordinarily kill somebody, but because of the combination of your heart problem and the drug, you die. So it didn't exactly kill you, it contributed to your death. There's impairment, so all the different like alcohol and recreational drugs that are um, damaging to the brain temporarily and possibly long term. But the main thing I'm focusing on here is the fact that if you're under the influence of drugs and you're driving a car, you're not able to do what you're supposed to do. They can also explain behavior. There's one drug called devil's breath in South America where they blow it in someone's face and the person is almost in like a dreamlike state and they'll do whatever they're told to do. If they're told to go empty their bank account, they'll go over to the ATM, they remember their code, they'll type it in and get the money out. So that chemical explains behavior. So the cause of death and contribute to death things kind of are the big risk, but there's also a lot of physical damage that can happen from chemicals, even if they don't lead to death. So let's look at a couple different things here. So here's a guy before he was exposed to dioxin, and this is what he looks like a couple years of recovery later. So massive damage to his face. He's got a symptom called chloracne, which causes huge, like, volcanic pimples across large portions of the body. Dioxin is also called Agent Orange. It was used in Vietnam to kill off plants, but it does really bad things to people. We have down here arsenic exposure. So this person has long-term exposure to arsenic and it's causing skin lesions. We have people over here who have been exposed to poison gas in the Tokyo subway. So sarin gas has caused respiratory problems, nerve problems, and these people are only either very mildly affected by it or just upset by the loss of their loved ones. But a number of people died, nowhere near as many as they intended, but the poison gas caused a lot of different issues with lungs and respiratory. There are a number of different aspects of a chemical that will impact how much of an effect it has on your body. So the first thing is the chemical or physical form. Different compounds that contain a chemical have different lethalities. If it's a different state of matter, it might impact how poisonous it is. There's the mode of entry into the body. So I have this picture over here of swallowed, inhaled, injected, or absorbed. The one thing that's missing there is it puts inhaled through the nose and inhaled through the mouth together as inhaled. I don't know if you know this, but if you snort something, it's called insufflation instead of inhalation. All right, so the mode of entry into the body is going to make a big difference. There are some chemicals that if you swallow them, your stomach acid almost completely destroys them, and you don't have much of an effect, or you have to take many times more of it. Injection is one of the fastest ways into the body. However, snorting is also one of the fastest ways for things that affect the brain. So inhalation, injection are two of the fastest ways for chemicals to impact you. Swallowed is lower because your stomach can break down some of it. Absorbed is one of the rarest. Not a ton of chemicals can pass easily through your skin. That's why you have skin. Okay, so also characteristics of the victim make a difference. Body weight, underlying health, that kind of stuff will change how much impact the chemical has on you. The time period of exposure, some chemicals are super toxic if you have a lot of it at one time. Other ones, if you have a lot of it at one time, your body will flush out most of it and you'll probably survive. But if you're poisoned a little bit every once in a while, it builds up over time and you're more likely to die. So then there's also the presence of other chemicals in the body. And I have a typo, it says or in the, and just stops. So the presence of other chemicals in the body are going to make a difference. They used to have a drink called Four Loko that they would sell that had both caffeine and alcohol, and that caused big damage to hearts because having a stimulant and a depressant put together causes more damage than either one individually. And then, of course, the dose will impact how much effect it has. More of the chemical should do more than less of the chemical. Earlier I mentioned LD50. LD50 is one way of measuring how much of a chemical takes to kill something. So it's the lethal dose for half of a test population. So LD, lethal dose, 50, 50% of the population. So that means that if you have a bunch of animals and you give them this chemical and none of them die, and then you up the dose for a different test group and 50% of them die, the amount that it took for 50% of them to die, that's the LD50. It doesn't mean any one person or animal is guaranteed to die. It means that there's a 50-50 chance of death at that dose. So that's pretty likely to be deadly. If you had more than that, it would logically mean that you are more likely than not to die from it. And they don't calculate this with people. There are certain chemicals where you will actually find LD50s for human populations, and that's based on very long-term studies of people and how much they were exposed to and whether they died. And there's also certain military ones where they exposed people in controlled situations to a chemical, and then if the person needs medical resuscitation, then that counts as killing them. So those ones are always creep me out. I need to know more about those studies to really know how much control they put into it, but usually it's done with animals. So when you're talking about the lethality of your chemical, this table here is a good way to get an idea of, in general, how toxic is it. So if you have less than 1 milligram of the chemical per kilogram of the body of the person, that means that it is extremely toxic. That means that for an average human, so an average adult human is going to probably weigh less than 100 kilograms. Because 100 kilograms is 220 pounds. So that's not extremely big. It's not extremely small. It's somewhere in like a full-grown adult person. That's going to be a realistic mass for a person, and 100 makes it easy. So if it's 1 milligram per kilogram, that means 0.1 grams is enough to kill you. That's a very tiny bit. If it's 1 to 50 milligrams per kilogram, that is highly toxic. 50 to 500 milligrams per kilogram of body mass, that's about an ounce of it, moderately toxic. 500 to 5,000 milligrams, you're talking about half a gram to 5 grams. That means about a pint of this chemical, and that means it's going to be slightly toxic. If you have 5 to 15 grams per kilogram, that means you'd need like something around a quart of this kind of chemical, unless you're talking about pure stuff. That's practically non-toxic. And then down here, if you need more than 15 grams per kilogram, you're talking about more than a quart of the chemical. That's like something like Jolt Cola or something, because it's going to have enough caffeine to eventually kill you, but you have to drink a lot of it to do the damage. So some of the most deadly things in the world are tetanus and botulism. Tetanus is what you might have heard of as lockjaw, because tetanus, which is a toxin that comes out of a bacteria that grows in the ground, and it kind of clusters around rusty metal, it kind of helps it grow better. So if you step on a rusty nail in the ground, you could possibly get tetanus, except for the fact that everybody who gets their immunizations is immunized against tetanus. So the tetanus thing has 1 nanogram per kilogram. So that's times 10 to the negative 9th grams per kilogram of body mass. So if we have that 100 kilogram person back there, that's going to be that many grams would be required to kill them. That wouldn't even show up on the best digital balances we have in the chemistry department. It's a really tiny amount. And this is the same for botulism toxin. And if you're not recognizing botulism toxin, you might recognize it from Botox. Botulism toxin permanently destroys muscles in your body. One molecule of the toxin will permanently bind to one muscle cell and kill it. So it has to regrow the muscle cells. So this is super, super, super toxic. And they inject this into people's skin using really tiny needles to kill the muscles and have the face relax. But if this is done by someone who isn't a medical professional and they accidentally inject it into the bloodstream instead of into the skin, then what you're going to end up having is these particles going through your blood system and binding to muscles like your heart, and it can be fatal. So getting a Botox injection from anyone other than a licensed medical professional is a really, really bad idea. And when you're talking about how lethal the chemicals are, there are 2 different methods of exposure. Acute exposure is when a person is exposed to a single large dose that does enough damage to them to either be fatal or significant impairment. But it is one single dose. And this is going to be the kind of exposure that is threatening for stuff like cyanide or for carbon monoxide or for a bunch of different things like that, because they prevent your body from processing oxygen. And if you get enough of it, you die. If you have a whole bunch of a whole bunch of like anthrax, that's going to be bad. If you have a little tiny bit, your body will fight it off. Chronic exposure is going to be really threatening for stuff like heavy metals, because heavy metals will build up in your body. You're not going to get rid of them, and they'll interfere with cellular reproduction. So over time, you get more and more and more symptoms as the amount of chemical in the body increases. And basically, the way this thing works is once it is identified, if it has been present for a long time, it causes irreversible damage or death. Acute exposure, on the other hand, is often going to be deadly if you don't get medical attention. So acute exposure tends to be medically treatable, whereas chronic exposure is not as medically treatable because the damage is not able to be repaired. When they're doing an autopsy, they're going to look for irritated tissue because most of these toxins will cause damage to the tissue. There are certain chemicals that have certain odors to them, like cyanide has a sort of a cherry or burnt almond type of smell to it. There are Mies lines, which is when you have a fingernail, or all of your fingernails, I should say, and I don't know why it shows blue, but there's your blue finger. You got your fingernail right here. And if you have lines across the fingernails, on all of your fingernails, each one of these things are like a precipitated chemical that was in your body. So as the fingernail grows out, at this moment, there was poisonous chemical in the body and it deposited the fingernails. So these lines show the repeated exposure to chemicals. If you have a single line, that would be just one exposure. If you have multiple lines, it would indicate more exposure. They also have ways that they can take hair and process the hair and figure out a timeline of poisoning. Since chemicals will decay or be metabolized, they concentrations need to be taken multiple times. Postmortem concentrations need to be done at the scene, which means that they would also need to take samples of the surrounding material. So if you find a body in the ground or laying on the ground, they would take soil samples to see if the soil has the chemical in the body. And they would want to take samples near the body and farther away from the body. Because if all the ground has, let's say, arsenic in it, then that means that there's contaminated soil and maybe the person wasn't poisoned. Maybe they picked it up after they died. But if there's cyanide in the body, right around the body, and then nowhere else in the ground, then that would mean that the arsenic came from the body itself. And while this is pretty gross, human specimens can be taken from almost any different part of the body. Blood, urine, bile, that kind of stuff, hair, nails, stomach contents. Well, those are all pretty straightforward. Liver tissue, okay, because the liver processes toxins out of your body. Yeah, so they take a sample, analyze it, see what chemicals there are. Some things cause damage to the brain or the kidneys, so they need to test those. But this one in particular grosses me out. The vitreous humor is the liquid inside your eyeball. It's kind of a really thick, sticky liquid, and certain chemicals will deposit in the eyes, so they're going to have to take some of that fluid out and chemically analyze that. Gross. So one example of toxicology that you have heard of, I'm sure, is blood alcohol content. So there's this machine that's called the breathalyzer. And the breathalyzer is a field toxicology equipment. If it's maintained appropriately, which I have read that many of them are not, but if it's maintained appropriately, then breathing into this is going to give a reliable indication of the percentage of your blood that is alcohol. So the legal limit is 0.08%. So that means 0.08% of the blood volume is actually made up of ethanol. When you think about it, replacing even that portion of your blood with alcohol is probably bad for you. So body weight, how much alcohol is in the actual beverages, number of beverages consumed, and how long it's been since you took them all will impact the dose that the breathalyzer gives you. So if you're looking at a poisoning case, the concentration in the body can be impacted by the characteristics of the person's body. The amount of chemical present in the body can be impacted by how concentrated the poison was, how frequently it was given, and how long it's been since it was taken. So if a person has taken a chemical that causes biological damage over a long period of time, but also gets flushed out, sometimes measuring the contents of their body at the end of their life isn't really that helpful. It might only tell you that there's a little bit left over and lead you in the direction of what to search for. Okay, so hopefully there's something in this presentation that helps you understand more about what kind of information you're going to be looking for this project. And if you have questions about what was in here, or if you need more clarification on any of the actual features of the project, please let me know. I am here to help.